Welcome, everybody. Happy Sunday. Thank you so much for joining the Newburyport Literary Festival on our second event of our online day. I'm Leslie Hendrickson. I'm on the steering committee of the Newburyport Literary Festival. We want to first thank our sponsors. That includes the Mass Cultural Council, the Newburyport Bank, and the Institute for Savings. Those organizations help keep the festival running. So thank you so much. Liberty, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, Leslie. Thank you for inviting me to be here in conversation with Kathleen. I am not very far from the festival, but super lazy. So doing this from my office was even better than like driving a few minutes. And I'm so excited to talk to you. Hello, Kathleen. This is our first meeting. How are you?
Good.
Great. So we are here today to talk about your latest novel. Could you please kick it off by telling us a little bit what it is about?
Yes. So here it is, From Dust to Stardust. And I am joining from Chicago, and that's where the inspiration for this book comes from. And so it's based, like much of my historical fiction, on a real person who back in her day was super famous and who nowadays is way less famous than she was and than I think she should be. And so her name's Colleen Moore, and in my book I rename her Doreen O'Dare. And so she is a silent film star. And so this book kind of follows her ambitions from when she's very young to becoming a movie star, all the way through to sort of her second and third acts of life. And I think the big things to know are that she is one of these people. I'm fascinated by people who just seem to have an innate sense of what they want to do. Like, I think knowing what you really want in life is kind of a superpower. And it's certainly great for a story to just sort of be like, why does this person want this? And are they going to get it? And then I think the other thing is, to me, I'm fascinated by people who have success in one field and then can like succeed in another. So after her big silent career, which we'll probably talk about, she built this 1-ton fairy castle, which maybe some people on the webinar have heard of, maybe not, but it's here in Chicago, on the south side at the Museum of Science and Industry. And so she built this as the talkies were coming in. Her marriage was falling apart because she's the inspiration for the original A Star is Born. And then she toured it during the Great Depression to raise money for charity. So I don't know, it was one of these things where I learned about her when I was 8 years old. And then when I wanted to write a novel, I was like, wait a minute. So so that's, I think, in a nutshell.
I think that covered it. That's great. But now I'm going to ask you lots of questions about it. Starting with when she's young. No, her name is not Doreen originally. Her name is Eileen. She changes it for the films, like Colleen did. And when she's young, they're not well off. Not as poor as her grandmother mentions. They're like inconveniently poor. I think her grandmother refers to them as. And they're living in the States. Her parents are from Ireland, and her grandmother. And her parents are not supportive. Her father is abusive, and they even when she becomes a star and her parents are living in California on her dime, especially her mother doesn't seem to support what she does. In fact, she thinks it's terrible. Being a Hollywood star is, being a harlot, basically. Can you talk a little bit about her relationship with her parents and what positive influences and support she had that led her to pursue her dreams in spite of them?
Yeah. So I think, I love this question because it also kind of like indirectly asks a question that I get a lot, which is, when you're a historical fiction writer, people are like, how did you decide what to change or what's real and what's different? And so I wanted to sort of, to me, the thing that was interesting about her life was sort of its fairy tale contours. This, girl kind of Cinderella, from nothing going to, having it all in a way. And so by all accounts, the real Colleen Moore's parents were super supportive. But for my purposes, I wanted to have it more that sort of like, misunderstood thing. And so, but the thing that's true of both the real life inspiration and the thing that I love in the book and wanted to explore is that there's this figure, Granny Shaughnessy. And so I think grandparents, particularly grandmothers, are really interesting figures in a lot of people's lives. And so I liked this idea of this Granny Shaughnessy figure in the book who was from Ireland herself and sort of has this, she's not educated in a formal way, but she has this deep intelligence of like folklore and fairy tales. And so fairy tales of the kind that are not like the sanitized Disney versions, but sort of the original, truly like bizarre, weird, kind of hard to categorize ones. And so specifically like this lore of Celtic fairy tales and this concept of thin places, which maybe some people are familiar with. And it's this idea in Celtic folklore that there's places in the world where the barrier between like whatever we can see and whatever is real and material gets thin, and you can sort of cross over into this other world, this invisible world, which is populated by, you know, fairies and spirits and just stuff that we don't like see or understand. And so this idea that if you get to a thin place, you can cross over yourself, or the things from there can cross over to you. And so I just love this idea of a grandmother kind of telling these outlandish stories and really sticking in my character's mind. And then this parallel, and this is the kind of thing that's like, I hope it subtly comes through in the book, but you also might not get it. It might just be a thing in my head. But sort of like the way that the thin places in fairy tales replicate the thin place that is cinema. Because to me, like when you're watching a film or really any kind of art, that is sort of this place where, particularly on the silver screen, and I think particularly like 100 years ago when we hadn't all seen like a million movies, you know, in our whole lives, that idea of this screen where you got to see these people and like live their stories for a couple of hours and then come back to your real life. I don't know. I just thought that was like, from a fiction perspective, that was cool. And so that's why I had like Granny Shaughnessy be this like support system.
I heard this great quote once. I can't remember who said it. It was grandparents and grandchildren get along so well because they have a common enemy, which is how I felt like about Granny.
Totally.
And Doreen. So she gets a chance, thanks to her aunt and uncle, to go to Hollywood and meet with D.W. Griffith, who was, you know, famous director at the time. And Granny is her chaperone and goes with her. And can you talk a little bit about how she became an actress despite the fact that she was not conventionally beautiful, that she was told repeatedly that she was not conventionally beautiful, and also a little bit about how young the actresses were in these silent movies?
Yeah. So a thing that I love about historical fiction is, you know, how like, I mean, it's a cliche, but it's a cliche because it's true, like how much the past teaches us about now. And like the past is so different, but also extremely similar. And so to the sort of point of her youth, like I think what's interesting is like the real life inspiration lied about her age, as many, you know, women of her time, particularly actresses, did. And so she, you know, was either 14, 15, or 16 when she went. And like even her descendants are like, we're not sure how old, you know, grandma was. But in the book, I choose to make her 14 because that was typical. And so, you know, there's kind of this joke in the book of how, you know, some famous director once rejected a baby because it looked too old, you know, which is like funny but true. And so like the camera then and now was like kind of notoriously unforgiving and would pick up, you know, everything. And so youth was the commodity for men and women. But you know, kind of like in our own age with all the, you know, Me Too stuff and the sort of like objectification, there was like this undercurrent of predation. And so I thought that, to me, that seemed like a fairy tale too, this idea of this young girl, almost like Little Red Riding Hood, going into this land of wolves. And instead of, in, you know, Little Red Riding Hood going to grandma's house, she like has grandma with her. Like, you know, grandma's like there to help protect. And so I think I tried to sort of tell the story of like Doreen kind of succeeding, but also like the perils that she faced and had to sort of navigate, and didn't totally avoid herself, because she did end up with this you know, husband who was both like a help and ultimately like big hindrance and a big problem. So, you know, I sort of think that was part of it. And then also this thing that was interesting to me is like when she hit Hollywood in the 20s, like really, I mean, she came in the teens, but the 20s is when she broke, like 1923. it was this shift in the idea of what was beautiful. And I think sometimes there's this thing, called presentism, where we have this bias as people to thinking like, okay, the way we think in 2024 is correct. Like after all these years of human intellect and cognition, we've hit the correct way of thinking, which of course, probably not. Like ideas are kind of like fashion. They're like pants. We put them on, we take them off. We're like, oh, skinny jeans. Why did we think that was a good idea? But there was that with like beauty. And so she kind of was at this point where people like Griffith, who you mentioned, had this very old timey idea of like domestic womanhood and the angel in the house and like long flowing curls and like a particular figure. And Doreen doesn't have that. She's like skinny, she's tomboyish. She's kind of like flat chested and awkward, but this is just like hitting at the right time when the flapper is coming to be. And so I think, long answer, but I'll wrap it up. Like the flapper now, I think, is sort of seen as like a fun Halloween costume, which it is. You like put on a little fringy dress and like a headpiece and you're like, haha, I'm a flapper. But I think we don't realize, and I try to like point it out in the book, how radical and liberatory it was. Cause like the flappers are the ones who like took off the corsets and like took off the like restrictive garments and were like, we're going to just like wear what we want and like drive a car and kiss men that we're not going to ultimately marry and be with forever. And now it seems, a little tame, but at the time, I think it was a big deal. And so I just thought it was interesting that this character sort of had the look just through dumb luck, just through, that's just what she looked like. And she just like hit at the time and was able to like pursue this like new womanhood and like really take it far.
I'm going to jump ahead in my questions in here and talk a little bit more about flappers, because she was known, Colleen Moore was known as one of the most famous flappers of her time. And she also does something very controversial for a woman for her time. She cuts her hair.
Yeah.
She has the famous bob. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about, in case there's anybody out there who doesn't know what a flapper is, if you could talk a little bit more about what a flapper is and why it was both a positive and negative label for her to have and how it changed her career.
Yeah. So in 1923, there was this movie called Flaming Youth, and it was based on a novel, as still happens. It was adapted from this very successful novel to the screen. And it was this book that was published by this guy who went by the pseudonym Warner Fabian. And he was actually from Massachusetts and sort of set it in that area. It's a fun book to go back and read because it's just so salacious. It was a success, the scandal. And it's about this Fentress family who are kind of like a upper crusty family. And they have this daughter, Pat Fentress, who is a flapper. And so prior to sort of this year, 1923, Colleen and therefore Doreen had sort of this successful career. She worked consistently, but she couldn't really break out. And she kept getting typecast. Like ethnicity was really played up in Hollywood at this time. And so because she was Irish, she kept getting these, like Irish maid parts and like long suffering, like Irish mother parts. And she kind of wanted to like break out of this sort of like Sunday school role. And so she read this book and was like, this is it. Like, this is the character for me. And so to speak to the flapper, like it comes, some people, it'd be a fun trivia question, but like, why are they called flappers? These were like young women who were in many cases like going to college, the first women in their family to go. And it was their careless style of dress. So they would put on their galoshes, which at the time had little like closures, and they wouldn't close them. And so they would flap. And I just love that because it's kind of similar to like, teens today who are like, I'm not going to tie my shoelaces, or like guys who wear their jeans all sagged and you're like, but I can see your underwear. It's just this like rebellious style of dressing that like irritates, old people. But it's representative of again, this like liberated thing. And so, I had a great time writing the scene in the book where she like realizes that to get this part, she's going to have to change her appearance. So she bobs her hair, which again, she wasn't the first person to do it, but she really like popularized it and her career just took off. And if you Google Colleen Moore, which I hope, my book inspires people to do, her bob is like impeccable. I mean, I love Clara Bow and I love Louise Brooks and I love all the flappers, but to me, it's like the bob to end all bobs. And I love that she did it when she was so young and then she just wore it. If you look at pictures of her when she's like in her 80s, she still has like the perfect haircut. And just to speak a little more to the kind of scandal, when the film came out, because, you know, it does show her in sexual situations, and, you know, there's like a skinny dipping scene in the movie that people just freaked out over. It just shows these it's very adult and very sophisticated, and you know, in the end she like does the right thing, but there's a lot of moral ambiguity over the course of the story. It was banned in Boston, so not far from Newburyport. In Wisconsin, there were all these like youth groups that threatened to like cancel the screenings of it because it would corrupt the youth. A proprietor of a theater in Seattle was warned that if he screened the movie, he would be arrested, and he screened it and he did get sent to jail. So again, I feel like The Flapper is this sort of, you know, kind of safe and cute idea from 100 years ago, but it really pushed the envelope in terms of what women were allowed to do. And it was fun to go back and sort of see like newspaper articles from the time, and how some people were sort of really supportive and really like, this is good, like this is freedom. And then other people who were like, this is going to be like the death of all morals in society, and we have to stop these crazy flappers.
Your answers are amazing. You're covering like so many of the things that I want to ask about like all at once. So I'm like trying to find like, where should I jump to next? So I'm going to go back to her Irish heritage a little bit. First of all, I was like amazed when I read that, you know, she was like in her early 20s, and they said she looked too old Irish matron to like play like a young part. And it was just like, what? But can you talk a little bit more about her Irish heritage, Doreen's Irish heritage, and how it played a part in her career, both in positive and negative ways?
Yeah. I think so all the way back when I was you know, 8 years old, seeing the fairy castle at the Museum of Science and Industry. At the time, you didn't just see the fairy castle, but the museum had all this wall text and all this ephemera that kind of explained not just the castle, but who built it. And so Kathleen Rooney, probably like a giveaway, like Irish Catholic background myself. And so it was fascinating to read about how this person from a similar area, because she spent a ton of time in Chicago and of a similar extraction, led this like totally like inner child driven life. Like she just seemed to like just get on this career and get on this trajectory and just take it to the end of the line. So I thought that was cool. But I also like, the more I dug into it, the more, I mean, again, it's still, you know, we still have lots of controversies about representation and like who gets to make movies and who gets to play what characters. But I guess not that surprisingly, 100 years ago, things were very almost like tribal in Hollywood, like people banded together. And so, yeah, you had a lot of like stereotyping and typecasting. And I think it was interesting to read like the reviews of her films from the contemporary era when they came out. And so many of them, I mean, she was born in America and she'd like never been to Ireland until much later in her life, but they wrote about her like she was sort of like fresh off the boat. And then also I thought it was like interesting when she was in this marriage, because she also married this guy John McCormick in real life, who, you know, becomes Jack in the book, who was also of Irish extraction. And the way that the papers covered their sort of like tabloid dramas was very, it just made her seem like this like dumb, you know, dumb little religious woman when she was actually so much smarter. And I just think, I don't know, that was just interesting to sort of see how I don't know, the pressures, like how she tried to break out of it, but also, you know, Doreen O'Dare, you know, lean into it. And I think the thing, one of the things that was interesting that just made me think again of how historical fiction is so relevant to now is there was this movie, she eventually got these contracts where she got multi-picture deals, which ultimately was good. She was a very savvy businesswoman, and she was like, well, I don't want to just make one and then have to find another one. I want to make a bunch at a time and have some security and some choice. But she got this contract where she had to do like a 4-picture deal. And one of the movies was this terrible, terrible script called Smiling Irish Eyes. And she was so grossed out by the script because it was just so full of like, you know, Ian Begora, top of the morning, like gross stereotypes. And there was this other movie that had come out prior, The Murphys and the Callahans, written by Frances Marion, one of her friends, that was so stereotypical that it actually got pulled. Like all these Irish American leagues were like, this is a gross way to portray us. Like this movie is offensive. And so it actually got pulled from the theaters. So like when, you know, this movie came to her and she was like contractually obligated to do it, she tried so hard not to, but they made her because of the contract. And so I think aside from just the ethnic piece, it's interesting to see like any artist of any persuasion try to navigate, I think, you know, like identity stuff, but then also ultimately, I guess, like economic stuff. Cause like in the end, the studio didn't make her do it out of any like anti-Irish sentiment, but just because they were like, you're a top star, you've got a contract, you signed it, we tell you you get to make this, and it doesn't matter if you think it's like garbage, you just have to do it.
And, you know, this is the age, you know, obviously before the internet and people would write things and you had no way to fact check them. And she was almost entirely in silent films. So no
Yeah.
one heard her speak. So they didn't know she didn't have an Irish accent.
Yeah.
And that was one of the things that struck me as I was reading it. I was like, I realized she doesn't mention like going over dialogue and scripts because she doesn't have any. And I liked the part where, you know, her co-star is saying like, don't say anything on screen because there are lip readers in the audience and they'll know what you're saying.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting. Did you watch a lot of silent films? Did you, you know, not just her? Like, are you a fan?
Yeah. So, I mean, you know, child of the 80s and 90s. So I came to this real life inspiration more through the castle than the films. And when I was very young, it wasn't easy to see silent films, but I started liking them even before I started writing this book. But then when I started writing this book, yeah, I just like watched a ton of them. And I think I don't know, I think it's such a beautiful genre. There's so many that are so good, but it was fun to kind of learn, like you said, and think like, oh yeah, like the way they made movies was super similar, but also totally different. And I loved learning about how I use the metaphor of like pioneers a lot because these people really were, they like, you know, went out west and started this whole new thing. And so, you know, some of the stuff that people were inventing, like, you know, close-ups and tracking shots and like figure out comic timing and gags and bits, you know, all that stuff still happens. But like the way that like a script would be, like a lot of times they didn't have scripts yet. And so there were these people, you know, learning how to become screenwriters. And in the book, one of her best friends is a journalist who's also a screenwriter, Adela Rogers St. John. And they would at first not do scripts because it didn't matter what people said, but they were scenarios. So you go back and you see these things are so thin compared to a screenplay now because it's just like setups, and it was much more improvisational. And so like there was no quiet on the set. People would just be like literally being like, okay, Doreen, now like do that again, but like with a big smile, or do that again, but spin around, you know, they just yell it. And then also like that was the thing, like when talkies came in, there were all these people who couldn't transition. And so there were all these stars, like as I got into it, there were all these stars who I loved who just like, that's it. And they don't continue on. And people like, I love Lillian Gish and I put her in here. And like, you know, she made a few, but she kind of like went more out to like the stage afterwards. Cause a lot of people said, even if they could make the transition, like they could memorize lines, their voice was good. They didn't have, like you said, like an accent or like a regional way of speaking that would have been distracting. It just wasn't as fun, you know, because there was like, I don't know, I probably a lot of people have seen Singing in the Rain. And I feel like that does a good job of kind of showing, you know, there's like the bit where they're all kind of like talking into the plant because like the microphone's hidden there. And so this like super dynamic art form that was almost like dance, like ballet, became for a few years very like in a box because the audio technology had to catch up. And so, you know, I think the thing that's interesting to me about Colleen and Doreen is she did have a good voice. She was smart. She could memorize lines, but she didn't like it as much and wanted to do something else. So if people are interested, I would say like my favorite of her silent movies is called Why Be Good, and it's 1929, so it's like the peak of silent movies. They've had years to do it, and it's just like the pacing. Like I feel like a contemporary audience will watch it and not be like, oh, how quaint, but like it's good. And then my favorite of her talking pictures is one called The Power and the Glory, and she stars with Spencer Tracy, and it's kind of this proto Citizen Kane, and she's great in it. But yes, I watched a ton, and I hope that when people like read this book, they'll be like, oh, I want to go see some of her movies, or go see Lillian Gish, or go see Marion Davies, and see what made people love them so much.
I have so many questions I want to ask you. We're already running out of time because we want to get to audience questions. If you have questions, please put them down below in the Q&A box and we'll get to those. So I'm going to ask you, because the castle is a big part of it. You talked a little bit about where Doreen's interest in fairies come from. she also has this amazing interest in miniatures, in tiny, tiny things.
Yes.
And could you talk about how those two things combined led her to create the fairy castle? And also, for those who haven't Googled it yet, like what it looks like. I mean, it's
Yeah.
like the Barbie dream house for Tinkerbell.
Yes. Yeah. So I think like to me, what was so compelling about this like parallel interest in being a film star and loving tiny things and building this castle is how similar they were. And I think back in early Hollywood, women had not all the power, but they had more power. I feel like in a way that they're only now beginning to reclaim in the 21st century. So there weren't lots of women directors, but like, and I kind of tried to show this with her career, like women would hit a point where they would have a lot of control over things or be able to be like, oh, I want to work with this camera guy again, or this is a set designer who I love, or this costume person, and almost be a director, like really have a lot of say in how the whole thing came together. And so sidebar, I think one of the things that broke my heart was with the coming of the talkies, there was a lot of like thrusting of women out of power. Like the studio executives took it as a chance because everything was chaotic to not just bring in this new technology, but to take people like, Louise Brooks, who was very artistic and very, I think a bad way to put it would be like a bossy, but like a good way to see it, just very like God level view of what she wanted her movies to be like and like push her out. So I think to me, like it was fun to show Doreen building this castle because she just loved it and had like this great personality that was like wanting to do cool stuff, but also basically being a director. And so, hopefully you'll Google the castle, but it's like the details have details. It's like a museum within the museum. It's like all structured around fairy tales. So there's like the library and like, the dining room, which is modeled after like King Arthur and has a round table, and like the princess's bedroom where they like thought like, what would a princess's feet go on? And they're like, mother of pearl, they just like debate everything. And then she also did a lot of stuff where, over her life, how it is. Once you tell people you have a hobby, they always, you're like, I like penguins. And then everyone gets you penguins for every birthday until you die. And so everyone knew in Hollywood that she loved miniatures. So like in the castle are things like Rudolph Valentino gave her two little knights in shining armor, little suits of armor. So she'd like put them in the castle. Or, when her marriage ended, she would, be like, oh, I hate this, this jewelry reminds me of this guy. So cut it up, put it in the castle. And to me, that's this very directorial way of thinking. Like it was amazing to read about her putting this castle together and think like, God, she would have been an amazing director. Like, just like you say the Barbie thing. And I think about her a lot in relation to like Greta Gerwig, like just this, almost like the Barbie movie, like a lot of the issues that her flapper movies were dealing with. And then a lot of the reasons that she left Hollywood and did this other thing was, she was kind of like, I can do more, and if I'm put in this little box, I'm not going to be allowed to do it. And so I encourage everyone to come to Chicago, go to the Museum of Science and Industry, see it in person. But if you can't, the internet is wonderful and you can just see all these little details. And one more, just because this is book people, and I think you'll like this, everyone on this seminar. My favorite room in the castle is the library, probably not shocking, but it has all these tiny little volumes. She was a big reader. Like she, dropped out of school when she was only in 8th grade. And so she didn't have, again, like a proper education, but she was so smart and she just read always. And she loved authors. So she would carry around these little books because she knew she would go to parties and see famous people. And so she would like go up to people like Eleanor Glynn or like Willa Cather or like FDR and be like, would you sign this little book? And so they're all in the castle. They're like the size of like a penny. They're very tiny, but they're all on the shelves. And I don't know. I mean, of course, I'm an author. I love someone who loves authors. Not gonna lie.
I read that it's now estimated to be worth $7 million, that castle, which is amazing. And could you talk briefly about what inspired her to take it on tour around the country?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think is kind of cool and that I wanted to like draw, again, I hope when people Google her, they fall down this rabbit hole, is after like a sort of lifetime of being a Cinderella figure, like I mentioned, but also playing Cinderella. Like my second favorite of her movies that I recommend is called Ella Cinders, which you get it. So she played this Cinderella character a lot. And I think as she got toward the end of her Hollywood career, she was only in her 30s. I mean, she was still so young by normal standards, but she wanted to like kind of flip out of Cinderella and become the fairy godmother. And I think she had this awareness that she had, as much as she worked hard and as much as it wasn't easy, she had all this help. And I think she wanted to help too. And so she built this castle with the idea of then taking it on tour and raising money. And I think, I put this in the book, and I think a lot of people at the time had the same question as people would have now, which is like, okay, you're a celebrity, you're rich, you're famous, we're in the Great Depression. Why don't you just take this pile of money and like throw it at the problem? Why do you have to like make this thing, send it around, do all this? And her answer was really smart, where she was sort of saying like, I don't want to be this like outside savior coming in and just like impersonally solving the problem. I want to get people to participate in their own salvation and also to rediscover wonder. And so she, once the castle was built, she took it on the train and she went with it. And she would do this cool way of fundraising where she would come to town, and usually there'd be like an opening night reception, kind of like, we could imagine now, where like the luminaries or the big, donors of the town or of the city, would come and like give a lot of money and like have this reception. But then the rest of the, weekend and a couple weeks that it would be in a department store. And adults paid 50 cents and kids paid 10 cents. And so you pay your dime or your 50 cents and feel like you were contributing to the welfare of your own community, and get to see this like beautiful object that, when you think of, again, I feel like we know the Great Depression was horrible, but when you really read about like just the abjection and the poverty and like how dark it was, to like give people this chance to come together and like be happy. It sounds cheesy maybe, but I just think it's hard to overstate how powerful that was. And then one other thing that she did that was so cool, and so I think ahead of its time, because a lot of people might still not think of it even today, because she was mostly raising money for kids, and a lot of kids with disabilities. She would do these days in the towns where she would have the kids that the money was going to go to come see it for free. And she had little things like, she knew some of the kids would be like blind or, just have various disabilities. So she made separate objects that weren't the precious ones that were in the castle, but little things that could be handed to the blind kids or the visually impaired kids so they could touch it and like see it that way. And like when you think of doing that like 100 years ago, I don't know, she was cool, and I want people to know about her.
Yeah, I was reading that, the cat, because when I first read about it, I was like, she brought this like 2-ton castle on tour, and I was thinking like, how? But then it's like 200 separate pieces, and it had electricity that actually
Yeah.
worked. And I was thinking like, electricity back then just sounds amazing. All right, I'm gonna ask you a couple more quick questions. I hope quick questions, and then we're gonna get to audience questions. So we've just met, but I'm already just in awe of your amazingly curious brain, and you must do so much research. And like, how often do you just fall down a rabbit hole when you're doing that? I mean, just in like one small paragraph in your book, you mentioned the Chicago Circulation Wars, you mentioned the Iroquois Theater Fire, while talking about her uncle who worked for William Randolph Hearst. Like how far do you go? Like, you have to be like, I gotta stop, or do you find other things to write about all the time?
Yeah, my research process, I love research, as you can probably tell, because I have such a curiosity about how people used to live. And so I think research, and sometimes people are like, oh, if you like it so much, why don't you just write nonfiction? And that's a good question. But I think nonfiction tells you the facts, but fiction tells you like how it felt. And so I'm into those things of how it felt. So I usually research for at least like a year or 2 years, just pure research. Like I get a topic in my head, and then I like tend to break it down into categories. So for this one, I'm like, okay, Chicago in this era, Tampa where she grew up, Los Angeles in this era. Okay, like the technology of film, the way, ethnicity worked, the way fairy tale, like I'll make these categories and then just like fill these research buckets, just fill them all the way to the top. So they're almost overflowing. And then once I get to the point where I know it's time to write, I try never to look at them again unless I get stuck. I fill it up. And then to your point, I love that you brought up that particular example, because, I'm fascinated by the Iroquois Theater Fire, big Chicago incident. I think, William Randolph Hearst is interesting, journalism of 100 years ago. But all of that would be so boring to just put into a novel just because I like enjoy these facts. So because I had her uncle, Walter Howie, who was like this newspaper guy, my tip in my process to like the writers there too, or people, curious about it, is do all the research so you know what you're doing, but then when you put it in, make sure you're tying it to the characters, like put it in a real person, because otherwise I think it gets bogged down and it gets self-indulgent and you end up with the book. This book is like a nice like 270 some pages, but that's where you start to get these like they're too big, they're too much, so it's like it keeps it in the personal realm as opposed to just research for research sake.
So I'm going to ask you one more question before we get to audience questions, but I do encourage everyone, if you haven't already read this book, to pick it up, because we have just scratched the surface of what is going on in here. We haven't discussed her marriage. She invested wisely and wrote a book about the stock market. There is so much in this book. The Patrick Henry quote that has haunted me my entire life. I was like, did they ask me to do this because there's a character named Liberty? Possibly. But today, because we're talking about books, this is a literary festival. My last question does not have to do with your book, but I want to ask you, today is Nancy Drew's 94th birthday.
Ooh.
And I was wondering if you were a fan, if you read her when you were young, or what books you loved when you were young.
Yeah, I did. So my mom was a huge Nancy Drew fan, and she had her whole set of them down in the basement. And so yes, Nancy Drew, I didn't know it was her birthday, but happy birthday to Nancy. I think the first one, The Secret in the Old Clock, that's a tough one to top. I feel like that's so good. But yeah, as a kid, I think I loved poetry as a kid. I'm a poet too, and so I think part of the reason I'm a fiction writer in general, but also like history so much, is like Mother Goose and like A Children's Garden of Verses, just those old timey weird rhymes. I think the past is so bizarre. And so, I love that stuff when I was a kid. And then one of my favorite writers now, who maybe people also like, is Peter Ackroyd, who's the London-based writer. And he writes such killer historical fiction, but also nonfiction. And he just captures those layers of of a city, and of like, Patrick Henry piled on top, just like how these things pile up and how we're all living in this like delicious, like incomprehensible layer cake of stuff. So yeah.
I did see this quote when I was reading it, because I did know you were a poet. And there's a quote in the book that says, "I persist in believing that poems do more than newspapers to mend the world." And I was like, I bet that's something that she actually believes.
It is. Yes.
So I am going to ask you a few questions now here from the audience. The first is from Anonymous. Loved Lillian Boxfish, so had to read Dust to Stardust. Love your writing. Wondered when reading Stardust how many films a star like Doreen typically made in 1 year.
Yeah, great question. It would depend on the year, but I think the thing that struck me and that I tried to show, Doreen and Colleen had crazy work ethic. And so they would literally, the phrase like cranking them out comes from early Hollywood, where the cameras were cranked. And so they would basically just like do one after the other. So you would finish one and then just start. If you were a popular star, and weren't careful, they would just exploit you. Like you would just make so many. And I think that was, Colleen/Doreen was able to kind of like make that work for her. But a lot of stars just made so many, like, 4, 5, 6 in a year, which when you think about it is a lot. And like a story that I mentioned in here, but that haunts me, is Wallace Reed, who was like this very handsome leading man of his day. And he was making so many movies, and he got injured on one of his film sets. And as a consequence of this injury, and as a consequence of the production needing to, go on and make money, and the investors not lose what they invested, they drugged him up. And so he became like an opioid addict, and it wrecked his life. He never recovered. And his wife, Dorothy Davenport, actually became an early advocate for, again, it's tragic. There's so, like, look at the opioid crisis here. And so I think, if you weren't careful as a star, even though from the outside you seemed like you had it all, the pressures were really, really intense, and it was like not regulated.
So you talked about this some, but Charlotte asked, could you talk about your research process and how you found your source materials?
Yeah. So like my hot tip that that adds to what I've already said is, like to not just read about the period, but to read in the period. And so I always do a combination of, looking for books that are by experts, like contemporary experts who have already done a lot of that work for us. you know, and reading their view from now, looking back on a thing, and then obviously going through their bibliographies and being like, where did they get this? But then also doing lots of primary source stuff and going to like Photoplay magazine. And like I said, a lot of the reviews that came out, you know, not just what people think of these movies now, but what did people think when they just came out? Because then you get the perspective, but you also get the language, because I think people just talked differently. And like I had a lot of fun with that in Lillian as well, but just trying to get the slang or the vernacular or even just the syntax, you know, the way people structured their sentences was not better, not worse, just, you know, people talked differently back then. So that's what I love to find in research, is like little turns of phrase or little you know, bits of slang or things like that.
Is it, do you worry about like anachronisms? Like, do you have someone check for those? Because I know like people can, you know, they're amazing writing, but sometimes like you just read over the same thing when you've written it yourself and you miss something that you might.
Yeah, I'm relentless when it comes to hunting for anachronisms. And then my spouse, Martin C., who is also a writer, helps me a lot too. And I think between the two of us, we catch, I'm like knocking on wood, everything. Like I try really hard because I'm the person who it drives me crazy when I'm like, people in 1780 couldn't have eaten chocolate chip cookies, you know, like those weren't invented. It's like dumb, but it makes me annoyed.
Okay, so last question is from Dara, or Dara, sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly. I can't wait to read From Dust to Stardust. Lillian Boxfish Takes a Walk is one of my all-time favorite books. How did your experience writing each of the books differ?
Yeah, I think every book, like the big difference is structure. So I'm a big structure person. And so Lillian, of course, was structured around her walk. So with that book, I started truly by pulling up a Google map and dropping little pins into where would she have been in her early life, and then what would have been there in the 80s when she was walking. So that was that. And then in this book, the beautiful thing is every chapter is a room in the fairy castle. Like I was so happy when I was like, oh my God, I can do that, because I know lots of writers wing it and sort of let the characters talk and like see what they want. And I think that's cool. And I do that to an extent once I'm going. But to get started, I really need an idea of like, what is my blueprint? What am I building? And so I think that was the big way they were similar but different. So with Lillian, it was a walk. With Jeremy and Major Whittlesey, the World War I, it was like, I'm going to hear from the pigeon. I'm going to hear from the soldier. We're doing this A, B, you know, dialogue pattern. And in this, it was like, literally, I'm building the castle with words.
Okay, well, that was amazing. I have so many more questions for you, but unfortunately, we are out of time. But thank you so much for answering my questions, for the audience questions. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Kathleen, for speaking.
Yes, thank you. It flew by. That was beautiful. You're amazing, everyone. Thank you so much.
It was a great conversation. Thank you again to Kathleen and Liberty, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Yes, thank you. Bye. Happy Sunday.
Take care.